You're listening to Parasearch Radio. News, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch Radio or their affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised.
And a very good evening to you here on this week's Haunted Histories with yours truly, Penny G. Morgan. I hope you're all keeping well. I hope nobody has got caught up in any of the snow or the storms or anything else that's been battering us over here in Blighty this week. And if you're listening in from somewhere other than Blighty, I wish the same to you wherever you are. However, if you tell me that you're in somewhere and it's hot and warm and lovely and you're outside in shorts and a t-shirt, I am never speaking to you again. But on that note, what have I been up to in the last week? Well, it's been a bit of a family and personal type thing. As some of you may or may not remember, when I talked to Jane Harris last week about Ettington, it was actually my wedding anniversary, the night that I was investigating Ettington. So my lovely husband, it's his birthday today. He's 40 today, or 2 times 20, as we're now saying. As he puts it, still younger than me, but, you know, age before beauty and all that. But, yes, so we went away last weekend to Blackpool, and we had a lovely, lovely weekend, although the drive home felt more like sailing home than driving, but we got home safe. We managed to pick our kids up safe, and all's good. All's good. What else have I got going on? Well, you probably heard us all mentioning it on Parasearch. We have a book out, the Book of Parasearch. Now, for those of you who think it's just a collation of things that we've written that you've already read, that's on the internet, all the blogs we've written, fret ye not. There's some new stuff in there that you will never, ever, 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 ever have seen before. Well, unless you're one of us and you've edited it, but it's never been released online. So you do have some special content in there for you. So get yourselves over to Amazon and buy that. Whilst you're over at Amazon buying that one, you could also click on my new book, A Haunted Experiment, under my full name, Penny Griffiths Morgan, and have a look at that one as well. If you want to know more, drop me a message and I will tell you all about it. And what else have I got going on? Oh yes, I've just been announced officially, although I have known about it for a little while, as one of the speakers at Karen Frey's Supernatural Fair event on the 7th of March in Evesham, and I'll be talking all about haunted workhouses, and it's free. Yes, it's a free event, and there'll be loads of amazing stalls and lots of other people there that you can hear talk, and I believe the special guest is my good friend Jane Harris. So yeah, no pressure. Yeah, be good to get some people's feedback on the presentation. So if you're in Evesham, or if you can get over there on Saturday the 7th of March, come and find us and say hello. But on that note, because I've got a really good interview to play out for you tonight, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to introduce my guest. Okay, so on tonight's show, I've never actually talked about a ship before on Haunted Histories, and it was actually Richard Estep who suggested I look into this particular vessel, and he was then kind enough to put me into contact with someone who works on her. But let me just give you some statistics. This ship was she was launched in 1934. She was named after a queen, and there's a funny story associated with that as well. And in today's money, she would have cost £223 million to build. She carried something in over 2,000 passengers. She would have had over 1,100 crew, and she was also, Winston Churchill said that she was pivotal in ending the Second World War quicker than they expected. Her name is the Queen Mary, and my guest tonight is the resident illusionist, Aidan Sinclair. Hi, Aidan, how are you?
Good, thank you for having me.
Oh, no, thank you for agreeing to do this. I have to say, you're based in LA, aren't you?
Yes.
Yeah, what's the weather like today? Just to make me jealous?
It is right now about 70 degrees outside. It's nice and sunny, a little breeze. having lived in London for 5 years, I don't miss the English winters. This is better, way better. So,
have you got a sofa? Can I come and stay?
We're a hop, skip, and a jump from Disneyland, so that's not a bad place.
No, you didn't answer my question there, Aidan. Have you got a sofa? Can I come and sleep on it? Thank you.
Absolutely.
You might get home from work one night and find this little blonde English woman asleep on your sofa, cuddling your dog, probably, knowing me. So you work as the resident, I suppose, illusionist on the Queen Mary.
Yeah,
but your job is a lot more than that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not the type of magic show you would expect. It's not we have no dancing girls or flashy boxes and card tricks. It's a style of magic that doesn't really exist anymore. We present a theatrical seance, so it's kind of one part history, one part ghost story, and one part illusion to bring the spirits to life.
Right.
So it's very story driven, and it's in a place that has a certain history with the paranormal. So it's an incredibly interesting place. And in addition to the show itself, at the end of every show, because my fiance and I are deeply invested in kind of the idea of the paranormal, we conduct investigations aboard the ship as well.
Right. So how did you get into it?
The paranormal or the magic?
The paranormal.
The paranormal really led from doing a show about domestic violence. We were approached to do a benefit for a domestic violence shelter, and we wrote a show that was about the asylum history in the United Kingdom and things that had been done to women. And it was compelling to me at the end of that show. There was really no magic tricks in the show. There was one effect, that was it, and it was more story driven. And at the end of the show, people were crying. People were emotionally invested in the material, and it was the first time I'd ever witnessed the effect of magic, a single magic effect that was used in a way that wasn't to surprise someone or trick someone. It was used to connect with someone.
Yeah.
So it kind of redirected my style of performance, and that led to developing a style of magic that embraced those old techniques of spiritualism and seance and having people have those kind of emotional experiences. So we approached the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado, about putting a production in there, and the owner, John Cullen, embraced the idea, and we became a resident there for about 5 years. We did the show at the Stanley, and we still produce a show there today. And then in 2018, we were invited to come out to California for some television work, and in order to maintain a live performance at the same time, we transferred the show to the Queen Mary, so it would be in Los Angeles, and we were able to film and perform at the same time. And much like the Stanley, the Queen Mary has this phenomenal history in addition to its paranormal history. So when you spend 5 years in a haunted hotel and then you spend another 2 on a haunted ship, you either get really interested in the paranormal or you put on blinders and you pretend that nothing is happening. I prefer to be curious about it. So I started having things happen at the Stanley that I just couldn't explain as a human, as an illusionist, and some of those things were extremely profound. And at the end of the day, there was no other answer other than the paranormal to explain what they were. So that obviously leads you to going down a lot of very deep rabbit holes and learning investigative methods. And fortunately, I have some really great friends in this world that has been their life for a long time. So one of my dearest friends is a gentleman named Grant Wilson, who everyone knows from Ghost Hunters. And he's one of the kindest people you'll ever get to know. And if you want to learn about investigating the paranormal, he was one of the best people to learn from, because he doesn't endeavor to search for ghosts. He looks for people.
Yes.
And I think there's so many people in the world of the paranormal that they become so fixated on death and finding ghosts, they forget they're people, and they treat them horribly, absolutely horribly.
Yeah.
And that also drives what we do today. So.
Well, you and I were kind of talking about this off air, weren't we? About how everyone always assumes that if there's a haunting, it's got to be that the spirit is trying to scare people, or they're automatically nasty, and it just comes back to treating them with respect and asking them interesting questions, and not treating them like performing monkeys and all of that kind of thing. And I do know that Grant, I don't know how many times, I know he's been at MJ Dixon's Sage conference before, and I know he's good friends with MJ and her husband. Him and his wife, I believe, are good friends with them. But when you were at the Stanley, was that when Carl and Connor with the resident team?
While we were there, there was a resident paranormal team, which is Carl Pfeiffer and Connor Randall and a young woman named Michelle Tate. And they would do these investigations of the Stanley. And what became really fascinating about it, and as I delved into the world of the paranormal, is that most people who do paranormal investigation, it's a hobby, and they save up for a year to just have a weekend at a haunted place to investigate. And in the day that they go to investigate, maybe they catch a day where something happens, but probably not. So the opportunity to gather evidence is really limited. The team at the Stanley lived there. Essentially they were there 3 to 5 days out of the week, and they investigated the same place. So they took an approach that was unlike anybody else in the paranormal at the time, which was not to investigate the paranormal, but to build relationships with what was there, to build a rapport with the entities, to have a positive understanding of them, and almost a friendship developed. And if anybody is really curious about, a really kind and human way to investigate the paranormal, I'd encourage them to look at, their YouTube series is still out there. It's called Spirits of the Stanley. It's beautiful to watch.
Carl's one of my favorite people. I got the chance to interview him last August about the Stanley, and I loved every minute I got to speak to him. He was also kind enough to let me interview him for my new book, talking about the Estes method as well. And I expected a few words back from him, and I had like a whole chapter of answers, which he's just, I haven't had the pleasure to talk to Connor yet, but I've had a couple of conversations with him on Facebook. But no, Carl, it sounds a bit stupid, but I'm a bit protective over him.
No, as you should be. He's collectively, the two of them are two of the kindest men you'll ever meet in your life. Just like Grant, they just there's no self-gratification in their investigative method, and that's kind of one of the disheartening things about seeing some people that indulge in paranormal investigation, is that it's for them. It's not for the entity, that they go in and they say, hey, knock on the wall, and if that knock happens, they go, thanks, see ya, and then they leave. Their approach is not, hi, we're here to listen to you, and what can we do for you, and can I help you? And I think you get a lot better responses when you pursue things in that way.
I think so too. I agree.
We used the Estes method quite a bit on the ship, and early on when we first started doing investigations on the Queen Mary, one of our first engagements was for the first month, we would just be met with, get out, go away, don't want to talk to you, leave. And we didn't push through it. We would say, okay, we respect you. We're going to come back on Friday if you'd like to talk to us then. And then we'd come back and get another get out, go away. And we'd say, okay. And we would leave. Finally one night we went down, and it wasn't get out. We said hello, and we got a hello back. And then right after the hello, we got a you again. We're like, yeah, we're coming back. We told you we would come back, and we've kept our word. And if you want us to leave, just say get out, and we'll leave. And we get an okay. So, it's like, well, this is kind of going a little better. And my fiance, Becca, is really good at asking questions. And she says, well, look, we're not here to make you do tricks. We're not here to tease you or make fun of you. We would just like to get to know you. And immediately out of Estes, we get this response of, everybody says that.
Mm.
And we said, well, we mean it. We really just want to talk to you. We're not going to ask you to bang on the steel of the ship. And we just want to get to know you. And the next thing that comes out of Estes is, I don't trust you. And we said, okay, we understand that. Yeah. And we'll try to build that trust. Is that okay? You can try. So we're now having a conversation, which was fascinating. It's a
step up from where it was. They're at least starting to trust you enough to talk to you.
So now fast forward 18 months, and now we have pretty consistent conversations. But every once in a while, Becca will say, hey, do you trust us yet? And it'll go, not really. And it's always there. It was a little heartbreaking. There was one night that she had asked, do you trust us? And it said, no, you'll leave too.
Oh.
And it's that how many people go into a place and have a conversation and then they leave and
they
never
see them again. Yeah.
Yeah. And they're justified in that. We try to be very honest. When we got that response, I spoke up and said, you're right. I'm a performer on this ship, and there's we're investigating in my theater, which was probably the mailroom when you were here. And you're right. There is going to come a time when the Queen Mary decides to turn it into a restaurant or a hookah lounge or who the hell knows what it'll be, because all things end. It's the nature of life. And there will come a time when I'm going to have to pack up my bags and I'm going to have to move. And it will be with a heavy heart. But while we're here, we can be friends. We can talk and we'll listen. And after saying that, we got to thank you. So I think there was an appreciation for the honesty of it, that we didn't lie to him and go like, oh, no, we're here for good. We'll do whatever for you.
We're never going away. We'll always, like we also said off air, honesty is important. There's no point.
It's huge.
It means more than people could ever realize. So, you've had a good background working at the Stanley, working with people like Carl and Connor and Grant, and I know you've done work with the Newkirks as well, and all those amazing names. And you're friends with John Tenney as well, and all people that I'd say most of us in the industry look up to and respect their views and their judgments and everything else. When you started working at the Queen Mary, and you and your other half started sort of looking into the paranormal side, what did you want to change about how it's conducted there?
When we first got on the ship, there still is a resident paranormal investigator there, and has been there for a very long time. And there's also been an association with a couple of authors who have written books about the Queen Mary. And it's very frustrating to read some of their work because there is no actual research done.
Right.
They lean very heavily into the accounts of what at the time was a famous psychic in the 80s who visited the ship. And he was the first person to coin the name Jackie, and that he had met the little girl who drowned in the pool and became friends with her. And that story has become legend, and it's taken on its own life. And instead of actually investigating the story, and instead of actually doing any kind of practical research, they've just rolled with it and said it's real. And what they lean on for it being real is thousands of people have experienced this entity, that they have seen this little girl in a swimsuit standing in a hallway, or playing in the pool, or walking down, the deck of the ship. And these are people who are not associated with the paranormal, who they don't go, hey, I saw a ghost. They go to the front desk almost on a weekly basis of the Queen Mary and ask the front desk manager to call the police because they think there's a little girl lost coming back from the pool, that they saw this little girl standing outside their room and they tried to help her and she ran away. And by the way, a swim sounds really nice. Where's the pool? And it's when they find out that there is no pool that they get a little shocked.
Because there used to be two pools, indoor pools, didn't they, in its heyday? Yeah.
Yeah. There was a second-class pool and a first-class pool. And later in the Queen Mary's history, it was a big to-do, was that the Queen Mary never called third class. They thought it sounded trashy by that
tourist
point.
class or something, didn't
so they? Called it tourist class. Yeah. So, and it made people, that could only afford that ticket feel a little more special.
Yeah.
But the kicker is that the records of the Queen Mary are intact. She was run by the Cunard line, and just ships in general keep good records. You have to. It's part of traveling by sea. You have to plot navigation and maintain logbooks, and everything that happens on a ship is recorded. It always has been and always will be. The methods have changed from analog to digital, but added to that, the British reputation of record keeping. There were government subsidies that were put into making that ship.
Yes, I was reading up on that. That when it first started being built in 1929, it was just for the Depression, and Cunard run out of money, and so they applied to the government for a loan. The British government, this is, because it was being built in Glasgow, wasn't it, or something?
Yeah, so it was launched the River Clyde.
That's it, and they applied, and basically the British government said, okay, we'll lend you some money, but you've got to merge with the White Star Line if we're going to do it for you. And so it was very, very heavily subsidised in its original form by the British government.
What's fascinating is that all those records are still there. There is an archive on the ship. It is not open to the public. You have to be you need to be a certified researcher, to have access to that. We get a little extra privileges, I suppose, because of the nature of our show. Yeah. That we demanded that, our show be historically accurate. So the first thing we asked for was access to the archives. So we made sure that the stories that we tell in a show are true. And all of the deaths are there. There are all these records of, who died and where did they die and how did it happen. And there's not a single death that ever happened in the pool. It never occurred. And that doesn't mean the little girl in a swimsuit named Jackie doesn't haunt the ship. It just means that the reason people think she haunts the ship is maybe not correct.
It could be that she'd been on the ship as a little girl, had so much fun swimming and stuff, died shortly after, and has come back to the ship because that's where she remembers having fun and she's drawn back to. Simple as that. Or she's come with another passenger. She's nothing to do with the ship, but she's followed a passenger and decided she enjoys it. Yeah.
We feel very strongly that, we have no way of knowing what happened to her. And I think it's the fixation on, because people see her in the swimsuit, they made this logical jump of whatever you wear when you die, that must be your forever clothes. So she's in a swimsuit, ergo she drowned in the pool. Yeah. So I can see where the logic came from and the belief came from. It's just not true. And it's very difficult to fight against a legend.
But that's why I started this show, Aidan. And that's why I do what I do, is because one of my biggest bugbears is this kind of thing, that people take what maybe a medium has interpreted, which is an interpretation for a medium. They don't necessarily see everything correctly. They have to interpret the signs they're being given. Or people have taken a few pieces of, shall we say, information, and it's been like Chinese whispers. And rather it being saying, well, this is what we think may have been, it becomes fact. So, like the show I did last week on a barracks, one of the things that they sell it in as a haunted venue is that it was a TB hospital. Well, I can't find hide nor hair of confirmation it was ever a TB. I've spoken to people who lived there. I have spoken to everyone I can, and everyone has said, no, it was never a TB hospital. So that's kind of one of the reasons I started this show, is to try and say, well, look, there's actually things that have happened that we can prove 99% accuracy. But there's also things that
they're speculative.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's, we always close the show. We introduce Jackie in our show. We talk about her in the show. And we kind of leave that thread of that. We let the audience believe in Jackie all the way up until the end. And at the end, we kind of tell the truth and go, hey, this didn't happen. But maybe this happened. And the allegory that we try to share is that maybe Jackie just was a passenger on the ship, and our ship, our first class pool, is the place where Jackie learned how to dive.
Yeah.
And I let that sit for a minute, and you'll watch people look at you like that's the dumbest thing they've ever heard in their life. And then you explain to them, you just ask people to go back in their memory and try to remember the first time they dove and they got it right, and how happy they felt in that moment. It's that combination of joy and success, and you'll start to see people nodding all of a sudden. I'm like, holy crap, yeah, that was a cool moment in my life. And that, when you got it right, you popped out of the water and probably shouted out, I did it. And then you got out of the pool and you did it again and again, and you kept diving. It was like, Mom, look at me, Dad, look at, and then, we try to encourage adults to take a moment and think, if you are over the age of 18, how many times in the last 5 years have you been that happy that you could shout something out and then repeatedly do it again and again and again and show off at how great you were at it? We don't. We get complacent, and we trivialize things because we get smarter and cooler, and we don't care. So maybe that moment was so happy for that child that's not a bad place to kind of hang out in, Yeah. And
so we're not saying she doesn't exist. We're not saying her spirit isn't on the ship. We're just saying don't automatically assume you're putting 2 and 2 together and making 5 as to why she's there. What about the, and again, I think it was this psychic who came up with this, the man who murdered his family in their cabin?
Yeah. That's one of the famous stories. It's still online. Same psychic came up with the story. And this is the disheartening thing, is this guy operated at a time when there was no internet. So you could go to a haunted place and tell a story, and then you could go across the country and literally tell the exact same story at another haunted place.
Yeah.
And nobody could Google. Nobody could, the only people who heard the story were the people that were there and heard him tell it. And then it, becomes notorious. So the murder story is graphic and it's horrible. And it's become a legend of the Queen Mary. Never happened. There was no murder. It never occurred. There is a very slim connection to the murder that is brought up. The people who were said to have been killed and the man who was said to have done the murder weren't even on the ship. The actual murder did happen. It happened in North Carolina.
Right.
A man killed his wife and family, and it's horrible. But the connection to the Queen Mary is fascinating. Is that the man's wife, her mother was English.
Right.
And at the time of the murder, the mother was sailing to the United States aboard the Queen Mary. She was going to see her family.
Oh.
And this, obviously, a family being brutally murdered, that tends to make headlines. So there is a telegram that exists that talks about this murder. The telegram was sent to the Queen Mary, advising the captain that this murder had happened in North Carolina, and that could he please withhold headlines from the wireless and make notification to this woman so that she heard about it in person and that she didn't hear about it through the news.
Oh.
So that is the only connection, and it's a very human connection. It's a very kind thing that, the Cunard Line was trying to make sure this woman didn't find out about her daughter's death, publicly. So we don't know if this psychic knew about the wireless, or maybe he just knew, little parts of the telegram and heard about murder and thought it was, he made an assumption.
Again, 2 and 2 makes 5. Yeah.
So we don't know.
Right. Because that's one of the things I was going to ask you. Some of these sort of stories I was reading, I was going to say, well, if you've got access to the ship's logs, this kind of thing will be documented. And I know you have got, I believe, isn't it like a plaque up in the ship that says all the people who have actually passed away on board? Now, there's 2 I want to look at in a second. But the first thing I want to talk about is the ship was quite a successful liner. It was going from Southampton to New York, wasn't it? Was it New York it was going into?
Yeah, that was her run.
It was about a 2 to 3 week crossing. Was that
no, not
right,
even. She was the fastest ship for a long time. She had the blue riband.
Yeah.
until towards the end of her career, the SS United States would take it from her. But a crossing would take 5 to 7 days.
Oh, it's 5 to 7 days. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and tickets, I mean, the figures I was looking at was it would be an equivalent now of about £3,500 for a ticket. And that was one of the things I was thinking of, that if a man was going to take his entire family on there and then kill them all, would he really spend £12,000-13,000 for the privilege?
Yeah, just
probably
for the privilege.
Not. Probably not.
In a place where you can't escape,
Yeah, exactly. You'd plan it a bit better if you were going to do it. But I mentioned in my intro about the Second World War. Now, because she was such a fast ship, she was seconded to the military, and she was repainted. I think it was March 1940 she was first put to use, and she was sent all the way to take Australian and I've written Kiwi down here, but New Zealand soldiers to the UK. But her nickname was the Grey Ghost. Yeah, because she'd been painted all grey, and she was so fast that she didn't always need an escort. Because she was so quick, she could actually avoid. Yeah, she could outrun submarines, and that was her advantage. Most ships during World War II were given these really bizarre, zigzaggy kind of courses, so that they could try to avoid submarines by dodging in that way. But the Queen Mary was so fast, she would often just go straight. They couldn't catch her. By the time they saw her, she was out of torpedo range. And that would unfortunately lead to tragedy in World War II. Yeah. Are we talking about what happened in October of 1942 with her escort? Yeah. The HMS, is it Curacao? The Curacao. Curacao, thank you. Yeah. I mean, this is horrific. And the poor captain of the Queen Mary, he's told not to stop for anything, because if there's a U-boat targeting him, if he slows down, he's going to get taken out. He accidentally rammed the escort ship. And at the time, the ship would carry 10,000 troops at a time. Yeah. It still holds the record for the largest troop transport to ever take place. Yeah. 10,000 soldiers would be packed onto that thing. So, he had 10,000 lives under his charge that he's expected to, get to the war safely. Yeah. And that's why Churchill loved her so much, is that, that they could move so many men so quickly that would make, it made a huge difference. So, but unfortunately, this ship he rammed, it caused nearly 200, well over 200 men's deaths. It was 347 to 349, depending on which account you read. They miscalculated, and it was again an accident of assumption. The officers on board the Queen Mary saw the Curacao take a turn and just assumed that they knew that the Queen Mary wasn't going to be changing direction. And at the same time, the captain of the Curacao thought the Queen Mary was going to turn. And it wasn't until it was too late that they realized that wasn't going to happen. And that brought the Curacao broadside across the Queen Mary. And the Queen Mary was so big and moving so fast that she smashed into the ship and sliced it in two. In the time it took the Queen Mary to pass through the wreck, she was moving at full speed. So even turning off the engines and trying to stop wasn't an option. She would still continue with her momentum. But in the time it took that ship to pass through the wreckage, the Curacao was gone. And all of those men had died. Yeah. One of the places that we investigate on the ship just forward of our theater is the forward rope hold. Right. What's that? And that is the very forward bow section of the ship, and that's where that collision took place. That's the bit that got slightly damaged, that she carried on to port with it damaged, right? She did. And it's considered one of the more active paranormal places on the ship. And unfortunately, much like Jackie, the reasoning has been distorted. A lot of people have experienced the sound of pounding on the hull and shouting men. And the assumption has always been, oh my goodness, that's where the accident was. It must be all the men in the water pounding on the ship to get in. It would be going too fast for them to do that, surely. Exactly. Anybody who's come up with that assumption is so
It's probably someone who's never sailed on a ship. You know, you look at the Queen Mary sitting by the pier, and it kind of makes sense. Oh, if you were in the water, you could pound on it, you know. But the ship didn't stop. And anybody that was in the water would have gone right into the propellers. It would have, you know, sucked you under. That's what it does. But that same section of the ship historically does have some darker history, that when she would carry American troops to the war effort, when she returned to the United States to get another load, the Queen Mary didn't sail back empty. They would put the wounded on board. They put families of people that needed to move to the United States on board. But they also carried prisoners of war. Yeah. You know, a lot of people in America have this really bizarre assumption that we didn't take prisoners ourselves. You know, it's really easy to villainize Germany considering all the things that happened.
And Japan and all those kind of countries. Yeah. Yeah.
But we did that too. You know, we captured people. And when you capture someone in war, you don't want them right behind you. So, you know, a lot of those German and Italian POWs that were captured by American and British forces, they would be kind of marched back away from the lines, and then they were loaded up on ships like the Queen Mary, and they were taken to prison camps in the United States. There's a lot of history with German soldiers that ended up, you know, in America working on farms and supporting the war effort in that way.
Interestingly, we have the same in the UK. And in fact, where I'm from in Essex, there is a proliferation of Italian families. And when I started looking into it, it was because we did have quite a lot of POW camps in Essex that were basically predominantly Italian POWs. And a lot of them got to work on the land and with agriculture. Yeah. And so a lot of them, rather than go back, because maybe they'd fallen in love with a British girl or that kind of thing, they stayed and opened things like nurseries, plant nurseries and all that kind of thing. So, yeah, it's I mean, the other one is people assuming it was the land girls who worked on the farms. And I met a client once. Unfortunately, he's not around anymore, but he had a farm. His family had owned it for like 150 years, where I am in Essex. And he was telling me that he had German POWs as his labourers on his farm, because there wasn't enough land girls. There was only a few hundred of them, because that's what Queen Elizabeth was a land girl for a while. Yeah. And there wasn't enough of them. So the POWs, and most POWs were quite happy to do it because they were treated reasonably well. And they, you know, they didn't want to just sit around and play noughts and crosses or tic-tac-toe, whatever you want to call it. They wanted to do something, and it meant they got reasonable food, and a lot of them were befriended by the families, and they were treated well, but they were still prisoners.
Kind compared to what you would receive on the German side.
Yes.
And that's the kicker, is that rope hold section where we investigate, where people hear men pounding on a hole and gentlemen yelling. That's where they held them. It was the most secure space on the ship. There's a big steel door that you can lock with padlocks and literally put 500 guys up there and lock them up. And all you needed was a sharpshooter up top. There's a big window that looks down from the bow. You can see all the way down into all of the storage and hold areas. So, you know, when you start really delving into the paranormal, you start understanding there's other types of hauntings, and that psychological trauma alone can produce activity. Sometimes you have a place where bad stuff happened, and the echo of that bad stuff seems to remain.
Yeah.
And the pounding on the hull makes a lot more sense when you think about guys pounding on the hull to get out, not to get in.
Yeah.
And if you were a German soldier, you probably knew what you did to prisoners and what the outcome of prisoners was. And I'd also like to imagine that, you know, the propaganda that would be given to a German soldier would be, if you get captured, they'll do the same to you. So you cram in all these guys into a confined space, and as far as they know, they're being carried across the sea to go to their death. Every mile they go, they're being taken farther away from their family, their homeland, their women. So the amount of stress and psychological trauma in that is insane. It's and
it would be
undoubtedly
imprinted on the steel hull of the structure. Yeah.
And that is the only records of the ship that we can't access, or that are difficult to access, I should say, because during that time, her war record is held not only by the Ministry of Defense in the United Kingdom, but by the Department of Defense in the United States. So it is logical to assume that, some of those soldiers did not survive the passage, that through violence or suicide or just war wounds, they expired in that space. But there is no record of it. So we have no way of knowing. Are
you setting me a challenge here now, Aidan? Because the first time Aidan and I spoke, he actually set me a challenge, which I'm going to tell you about in a minute, because this chap's story is awful, and it's moved me quite a bit looking into it. But just staying with the World War II thing a little bit, Churchill travelled on the Queen Mary a few times, and I believe he was down as Colonel Warden on the ship's records. And also I found, whilst researching my new book on a chapter I did on RAF Tibenham, that the Queen Mary was mentioned that in November of 43 she was responsible for bringing over an awful lot of the crews and troops for the 445th Division that were based at RAF Tibenham, which I just thought was a really neat sort of little segue into what I was writing about, and then what I knew we were going to be doing a show, and I got quite excited when I saw her name mentioned. I must admit, I think I told you about it, didn't I? And I got quite excited.
Yeah, so, Carl will tell you about synchronicities, and there you are.
Isn't it just? Right, well, there's two deaths on the ship that I want to talk about that we know did actually happen. And the first one was in 1949. It was in the September of 1949, and it was Senior Second Officer William Eric Stark.
Yes.
Now, this did happen. What happened to him, didn't it?
It did. Yeah. It did happen. That is a true story. He died because he drank tetrachloric acid, not intentionally.
He thought he was drinking gin or something, wasn't it? Yeah.
Somebody secured... Somebody had put some cleaning product in an empty gin bottle. There was no OSHA back then, people that, mandated how you store things like we do today. Mm-hmm. There were no chemical labels on things, and somebody thought, hey, this cleaning solution will fit in this bottle, and they put it there. And it was kept in the captain's quarters, and Mr. Stark just happened to have done a good shift, and they had a really good run that day. He had... that when they were competing for the Blue Riband, each officer, that was in charge of the ship would try to make a certain amount of distance per time. Mm-hmm. And if you managed to pull that off, then, that helped you get a little closer to your goal. So he had a good day, and the captain's reward to him was, hey, I have a bottle of gin, go send the steward to my cabin, and you guys are welcome to have a round on me tonight, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So William Stark didn't go get the bottle himself. He called for a steward to do it, and the steward delivered the bottle and poured the shot for him. And when he didn't sip the gin, he threw it back like a shot.
He necked it, as William would say. Yeah.
He was trying to get one in before another officer showed up. They were told they could have one drink, and he was going for two. And as soon as he drank it, he knew it wasn't gin. But it was too late. It had already gone down the gullet. So he complained about it, and he told the other officer, and he yelled at the steward for bringing the wrong thing. And the other officer was like, what did you drink? And he was like, I don't know. It was probably some kind of alcohol, cleaning product, something. And he didn't immediately kind of make a big deal about it. And they told him he should go see the doctor, and he said no. And then a few minutes later, he got sick because it's just acid that's burning him. Unfortunately, you can't undo that.
No.
So he had a very slow and painful death.
4 days, I believe, wasn't it? It took him 4 days to die. How awful.
And he officially died in hospital. That is one of the rumors, is that he died on the ship, and he did not. He was carried off of the ship, and he was still alive, and he expired at the hospital. But people often see an officer in uniform. But there's a lot of officers that served on the ship, and there's a lot of officers that had deeply personal connections to the ship. Yeah. So, again, it's that assumption that it's Stark. The first Commodore of the ship loved the place. And, he died at home just before the ship was going to be launched.
Right.
And his ashes were carried on the ship as well and given burial at sea. So, he loved the ship so much. Who's to say it wasn't, that officer that's seen isn't him?
Yeah. So you were saying the Commodore obviously loved the ship. So who knows if the man in uniform is Stark or if it's the Commodore, if it's another officer who had an amazing time working on the ship, met the love of their life for all we know, or achieved something they never thought they would achieve.
Yeah,
I guess.
And it's a stunning place. It's just it makes sense to me that some of the officers might have been around.
Yeah,
it's a great recording of the launch of the Queen Mary, and it still exists today. You can find it on YouTube. And in that recording, a journalist approached the Commodore and says, well, now that she's built, are you going to try for the blue ribbon? Are you going to go out for this prize? And you can almost hear like the, just the peak of the guy of, responding. Just goes, of course, what did we build her for? What else would we build her for? Why would you ask me such a ridiculous question?
It's very stupid. Yeah. Well, the reason we first started talking properly, apart from that I wanted to do this show, was you'd been told I was quite a good researcher and you wanted me to look into the absolutely tragic, and I'm not saying that with my tongue in my cheek or anything else, it genuinely is tragic case of John Pedder. Because you guys want to write something about him, because one of the things is that when sort of people first started investigating and staying on the ship back in the early 70s, John's case was incredibly raw then, because it only happened in 1966.
Yeah, it happened before she stopped sailing. So that's current history. Yeah,
and I have to say that I know at least one of his sisters is still alive, because she had been interviewed for a newspaper. It was about 10, 12 years ago, wasn't it? Because apparently a spy cam had been set up focused on the area where John had died. And she was really upset, justifiably so, that no one had ever approached the family. And I believe his mother was still alive at this point as well. No one had ever approached the family to say, do you mind if we talk about this?
Yeah, and it's heartbreaking that you get so caught up into the idea of like, oh, this person might be haunting this place, that they forget that person has been haunting the family that they have left behind for a very, very long time, and that's a wound that doesn't close.
It won't heal. It will never heal, and by knowing that people are treating it almost as a freak show, it's going to keep reopening that wound and basically pouring salt into it on a regular basis.
Absolutely.
Now John was 18. He was from Skipton in North Yorkshire, and I did locate a copy of the death certificate for you guys for his memorial, and it basically says he died at sea in a crush injury, but it was so much more than that, wasn't it?
There's we have a lot of questions about it. We have copies of all of the logs and the reports of what happened, and as far as what was witnessed is vague at best. There are emergency watertight doors in the engine space, and they were originally supposed to be triggered by an officer downstairs in the engine spaces, and the official report says that on that particular day, somebody on the bridge of the ship decided to have an emergency drill, and they pulled the switch for the door.
So for us non-sea people, what are these doors meant to do?
They seal in the event of, when you think of Titanic scraping against the iceberg and water rushing in, they seal very quickly to keep water contained into a specific compartment and therefore keep the ship from flooding.
And keep the engines running as well, so at least she can get maybe to a port or something. Would that be? Right, okay, right.
And unfortunately, Mr. Pedder was caught in the door when it closed. And that crushed him. It did horrible injury to him, and then he perished very quickly thereafter. The story has always been that John was playing chicken in the door, that these men were kind of dancing back and forth trying to get through the door, and it was a sport. You would see who was brave enough to go through just before it closed, kind of thing. We have a very hard time believing that that's true. He's an 18-year-old kid, but he wasn't a dumb kid. That's everyone knows how these doors worked and the amount of injury they could cause. So we don't know that happened. There is a lot of history that's been unveiled since the 60s that wasn't really public back then. And one of the things that we've learned is that there was a union strike underway during that time. That the firemen were protesting for better wages, and they had walked off the ship. And so in order to facilitate the voyage, they had non-union workers on board, and John was one of them. So, it's a different time, and that's a pretty brutal world. It's we all know, the idea of that world. And if you're around unions, it's a hard place. There are rules, and you don't tolerate people crossing the line to take a union man's job. So there are some questions about what led to that death. Now, did him taking that job, being non-union, did that cause some problems? And did someone threaten him? Did someone hold him in the door? Those are the questions that we have now. I don't want to believe that anybody intentionally murdered him or killed him. I don't think that happened, mainly because if you were going to hold somebody in the door, it would take two people to do it. And where murder is something that one person might be capable of, two is a little trickier.
And in a boiler room, it is such a dangerous place with all the gangways and everything else. There would probably be a lot easier accidents to have that would take less people in. Pardon?
That's what I think. If he was held in place, then I think it was probably a hazing kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that went too far, and those kind of things happen still today.
Yeah, they do.
And it's unfortunately one of those things that we'll never know, but it is one of the places on the ship that not only do we know the person died, but we know exactly where they died and how they died.
Yeah.
So, the allure to investigate there for a lot of people is very powerful. And that brings us back to that, that resident paranormal investigator that, when they do investigations on the ship, obviously that's where they got to go. They want to go there and they want to tell that story because it's so gory and graphic. But the problem with that is the investigations that are there, it's almost like a tour. There's this demand over X number of hours to go to the boiler room and the pool and room B340 and go to door 13. So the downside to that is if you go to door 13 and you start to have interaction, if you're doing an investigation that's based on the clock, it makes no sense to go like, oh, time's up. It's time for us to move to the next location now.
Yeah.
What does that say to the entity, that you're talking to?
Yeah.
That. So
the thing is,
when
we don't even know it is John. We don't know that it's John. It could be someone who actually saw it happen, and it's imprinted on their mind so much they keep returning there to thinking they could save him. One of the stories I read somewhere was that one of the theories was that he'd been doing work on the other side of the door, and that he'd left his superior's spanner or something there, and he darted back through to get it, and got trapped. But I agree with the sister, his family, saying that this was a horrific loss for us. It was the lad was 18. They'd already gone through hell with the research I managed to do for you, finding out that their dad was a World War II POW in Thailand for a long time. Because I found that his mum's. I found when his mum and his dad got married and then they didn't have children for quite a long time. And I started looking into why that was. And it was because he was a World War II POW until the end of the war. So, as a family, they've gone through all of that stuff. And then to lose their only son in such a horrific and it is crushed in two, basically. Horrific way. And then I can imagine as his sister, because I've lost a sibling, and not in as horrible a way as that, but I've lost one, and I can only imagine, even with my interest in the paranormal, how I would feel if I found that people had a sort of a camera on the room that she died in.
And
hoping that she was going to talk to them.
An attraction, you know.
I would probably rip their heads off, quite honestly. So I can really understand how his sister, how upset it has made her feel. But I do think, commemorating what happened to poor John, I think that's a good thing, and I don't think that's bad. But it's like you and I discussed. Yeah. It's the way he's done, but also not assuming that if there is activity around that door,
that it's malicious. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's one of the moments that we kind of hit in our show now, is that every single day for more than 50 years, people have boarded the Queen Mary in Long Beach, and it is immensely disheartening that today, when people board the ship, the most commonly asked question is, "Excuse me, where are the ghosts?" It's not who built her. It's not how fast did she go. What famous people were here? People don't come and look at the Art Deco art that is still here and the original pieces of the ship that are stunning. They ask, where are the ghosts? And when they ask that question, they most commonly ask, where's the pool? Where's the little girl? They don't ask about, the people who actually died there, which I find fascinating, because there's plenty of documentation. The very first round trip from the Queen Mary going from England to New York, it did not complete that voyage without somebody losing their life. A crewman named Mr. Golding fell. He fell, he struck his head on a piece of steel, and it killed him instantly. Yeah. He was the first person to die on the ship. And the last death was also a crewman, a man named Mr. Horsebaugh. He was a baker and a cook. And he died because there was no air conditioning in the kitchen. He overheated, and he collapsed, and he died of heat stroke. Nobody ever asked a single question about them. Nobody ever boards the ship and says, "Excuse me, who was John Petter?" They ask about the little girl who drowned in the pool that never drowned in the pool. Yeah. It's immensely frustrating. It's just, you kind of, it's that, the power of the internet, I suppose, the power of, if it's on the internet, it must be true. It's sad that that's the culture we live in now.
Well, I do hope, and this might sound trite, by my doing these kind of shows, that when people now go into these locations, they don't automatically ask about the tall man in the hat or the this or the that. Yeah. They actually do say, so show me, where was Winston Churchill's room? So show me, where were the POWs held? So show me, this awful area where John died. How old was he? Where was he from? Who was he? Yeah. Because these aren't television shows. These are real things, real people.
On that note, you'll get a kick out of this, is that we have a cleaning lady that has been on the ship for about 30 years. She's a sweetheart. And she went into the Churchill suite, which is where Churchill stayed when he would travel on the ship. And this happened about a month ago. She walked in and thought a guest was still in the room after checkout because there was a man sitting at the desk smoking a cigar. And she says to the man, "Sir, you can't smoke on the ship." And in a very distinct English accent, he kind of turned and said, "Be off now, woman. I'll do what I will." And she got offended, and she's Hispanic. So she went to the front desk to complain, and got the manager, and the manager goes back with her, and they open the door, and there's nobody in the room. And it hits her at that moment. There's a huge painted portrait of Winston Churchill, and she collapsed. She saw the picture and just, they revived her, and she was like, "That was the man, that was the man, that was the man." And then she kept saying it over and over again. And she's been cleaning the ship for years and years, and just became, you become blind to your surroundings after time. You take it for granted. So she's actually worked there so long that she doesn't see the picture when she cleans the room.
Yeah,
she doesn't.
No, yeah.
She just does her job and she leaves. The manager said when he went back in the room, he could still smell cigar smoke. And there was nobody staying in the room that day. There was nobody booked in the room. There was nobody in the room previous. There was actually no reason for her to even go into the room. It was just on her list by mistake that day.
I wonder if the date had some kind of relevance.
That's what we're curious about. We wonder if it's a residual, something.
Yeah.
But it happens a lot. We have guests that stay on the ship and smell cigar smoke in that room all the time. Or they feel a heavy weight, like a very heavy set person sitting on their bed while they're sleeping, like they sat on the foot of the bed. That happens quite a bit.
Well, I know he did mention the ship in sort of official documents. He did mention it in broadcasts.
Yeah.
So it did obviously mean something to him. Now, I'm going to end this interview with one last famous Englishman that you've told me about before we came on air.
Yeah.
That has a link. Alistair.
Yeah. Good old Alistair Crowley.
This is an interesting one, guys, so listen carefully.
It's been really kind of spooky and bizarre. So 6 weeks after we opened the show, people started experiencing things in the show that were not part of the show. People were seeing things, seeing shadow figures, having emotional reactions to, feeling like someone was sitting next to them. So that's what drove us to start really kind of doing serious investigations into our space, as we wanted to know who was there. Mm-hmm. And in the course of doing that, we kept encountering a really mischievous and kind of manipulative entity. During the process of this, I was approached by a homeless woman one morning at my local Starbucks who handed me a deck of tarot cards and said, "These are yours." And I insisted that they weren't. And she said, "No, they're yours." And I said, "No, they're not." And she looked me in the eye and said, "The cards said they're yours," and walks away. Wouldn't take any money for them. But it took 3 times. She gave them to me 3 times. Mm-hmm. And then I looked down at the box, and the name on the box is Alistair Crowley. She's handed me a box of Thoth Tarot. And they are very, very rare, second edition, first edition in the United States. And online, these things sell for about $2,500.
Right.
They are pristine. They were in brand new condition, never been shuffled. So the whole encounter with this homeless woman is weird. And what homeless woman would have this valuable thing? And of all the people to give it to, why did she give it to me? Mm-hmm. So we called John Tenney. Anytime something really weird happens in my life, I call John Tenney.
No wonder he doesn't answer the phone to you normally, Aidan.
No kidding. So, and it was, one of those days I called him and the phone didn't ring. He picked it up so quickly that it was just his voice on the other side of the phone. So you can imagine how weird that is when you call somebody and you expect to hear their phone ringing, and suddenly you just hear John Tenney's voice in your ear go, "Hello." And that freaked me out. So I told him what happened, and he goes, "Well, it's no surprise. There is a very strong belief that, his remains were given to an associate, a follower of his, and that those remains were buried under a tree in New Jersey." And I said, "Well, what does that have to do with me?" And he goes, "Well, you put your theater on the Queen Mary." And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Well, your theater, where it sits, was originally the mail room of the Queen Mary. And at the time that Alistair's remains would have been shipped, there were only 2 ships that carried royal mail and human remains, the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth." So
and Elizabeth was her sister ship, wasn't it?
Correct.
Yeah.
They were twins. So we were like, well, that's interesting. So a few weeks after that, we're doing the Estes method, and the person in headphones has been super quiet. And then all of a sudden, she starts saying things that are quotes from Alistair Crowley's writings. They are quotes from rituals, verbatim. And this is just this nice little, little old lady who has no idea who Alistair Crowley is. She has no history in the occult. She's just like, "Well, my daughter wanted to go do a paranormal investigation. I thought I'd come, and wouldn't that be fun?" And while she's
channeling Alistair Crowley.
Yeah. And while she starts saying all these really spooky, creepy things, we have a data logger running, and it was 64 degrees in the room. And while she starts saying these quotes, I look at the data logger, and the data logger is holding firm at 66.6. So we were like, that's interesting. And now we've gotten to a point where we actually get yes and no responses and positive reactions when we interact with Alistair. We ask for him by name, he responds. And we're open-minded enough in the world of the paranormal and the occult to also know that, someone can be playing with us. Somebody might go, oh, they think I'm this Alistair guy. I'll take on
I'll
that
answer because I
persona.
want to have a chat. Yeah.
So we have no way of knowing if we're actually talking to him, but there's this weirdness that happens, and it always seems to keep coming back to things that he had written. He responds very angrily if we ask about his daughter, if we ask about Lilith. We have brought up his wives in the room in Estes session, and when we do that, we get some pretty derogatory language coming out of people that had been saying really nice things before, and all of a sudden they're saying bitch and whore, and and you're like, okay, you don't like them, okay, we'll move past that, So it's an incredibly fascinating place, and if you're truly interested in the paranormal and investigating, and you ever have the opportunity or the means, it's definitely a place to bring your equipment and spend time. We just really encourage people that are so inclined to do so to be human about it, to be kind, and to not go, hey, give me evidence, and to say thank you and run away.
Yeah. It's not a freak show. It's not a circus. But I just think for any stowaway that you're going to have, having Alistair Crowley, that's pretty
it's
cool.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's awesome, but we're also very cautious. Mainly because this is a man who did believe in ritual magic and manifestation. And I do believe that if you have a belief in something, that is power. That if you believe in the archangels are very real to you. If you, just to give you an idea, we had an investigation one night, and the investigations there have been consistent. Stuff happens almost every time we try. And one night, nothing happened. Nothing. It was just dead. The only thing that we can say happened is we lay K2 meters out in a line, like almost like a picket line.
Yeah.
And one night we went down into the rope hold, and Becca goes, "Hi, we're here. Would anybody like to talk to us?" And the person in Estes said, "Bye." And then you watched the K2 go off in line, like somebody walked past and out the door.
Wow.
So later we found out that one of the people that were joining us for the investigation was devoutly Catholic and was a little bit afraid of the paranormal, a little afraid of ghosts, and they were wearing a St. Michael medallion.
Right.
So, and she was like, "I don't know why nothing happened." I was like, "Because I think St. Michael was doing his job tonight." You asked him to keep you safe and to protect you from things, and this is something that scares you. It doesn't matter if you believe in the archangels. It doesn't matter if you're Catholic or Protestant or atheist. She is Catholic, and she does believe. And that belief might just be enough to make St. Michael very, very real for her. And that's all it took for us to not have interactions that night. So it's just a strangely interesting world that we live in. And
I could talk to you about this for hours.
Oh, me too.
I really, really could. But unfortunately, we've had our hour chatting. But before you go, people might recognise your name because didn't you appear on America's Got Talent?
We did. I did America's Got Talent in a show called Penn and Teller's Fool Us. And so we've gotten some national exposure from that. But but mainly, I delved into this world because once upon a time I was not such a great guy. And
but we don't need to talk about that because you're very open about that in all your publicity and everything. But bygones, it happened.
Yeah.
But I just say, if anyone recognised your name and thinking, I've seen that name. Yeah, he has been on telly. He has fooled. Was Simon Cowell on the panel when you did America's Got Talent?
No, we had Howard Stern, Mel B, and Howie, and Heidi Klum. And honestly, they were. It was an amazing experience, and I had a wonderful experience with them. We had 2 standing ovations from them, and then other commitments came up, and I couldn't continue with the show. But it was the Stanley Hotel required us to be there full time, so we couldn't. just kind of piss off and go do TV because it was fun. But it's truly a wonderful experience. It was great.
So if people want to follow you and find out what you're up to, where do they need to go?
We kind of have a website called illusionsofthepast.com. That's all of our show stuff. We have a show on the Queen Mary, and we produce the show at the historic Stanley Hotel that is presented by Miss Clairvoyant. She is also a apparitionist, a conjurer of spirits, and then I still appear at the Stanley on special occasions and through the summer. So, and also you can check out aidensinclair.net, and we've got a little website there letting us know where we are and what we're doing.
And you've got your Illusionist Facebook page as well, haven't you?
And we do, yeah. We're on Facebook, Aiden Sinclair, and Instagram at Aiden Sinclair Magic with a K. So
wonderful.
Thank you for having us, Penny.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm sure you all agree that has been an absolutely fascinating insight into the beautiful and very, very historic Queen Mary. And I think what Aidan was saying about when you go into these places, don't just look at the sensationalist stories that you've read on the internet. Look into the actual people, and I personally believe, and he and I were talking about this off air, that you're going to achieve an awful lot more by actually taking an interest in a person, whether they be alive or whether they be dead. Well, that's been me for tonight's Haunted Histories. I hope you've all enjoyed it. Don't forget to join me next week. Don't forget to join Parasearch the rest of this week. You've got the PSH radio show on Thursday, and you've got the Dark Mirror show on Friday. But until next week, you know what I say, people. Have a good evening, sleep tight, and don't worry too much about things that go bump in the night.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.